All right, so throughout this time period so far we've talked about, there's been striking contrast between the histories, economies, and politics of Eastern and Western Europe. However, after World War II, those differences became especially obvious with the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact, which poised on one side of the Elbe River and the Western NATO alliance on the other. As so often in history, the underlying basis for these differences has been geography. So let's take a look at just a global map here, and we're going to be focusing on Europe up here in the middle. So first of all, Europe's latitude lies quite far north. For example, Rome, Italy is about as far north as Chicago. So if you draw a map going across, if you draw a line coming, here's Europe's latitude here. Here's, Chicago, and here's Rome. However, it has a much warmer climate, especially in the winter. I mean, we can describe what it's like over in Chicago during the winter. It's pretty, windy and snowy and blizzards, but Italy has a little milder winter. Now, this is because Western Europe gets the moderating effects of a warm current known as the South Atlantic Drift, and warm sea breezes coming across the Mediterranean from North Africa. So we actually get a warm drift that moves this direction, as well as North African drifts going this way. Now, Eastern Europe is too far inland to benefit much from either of these effects, and we'll be drawing our line kind of about here for Eastern Europe. And as you can see, most of it gets these nice warm drifts here. Eastern Europe is far too inland, and thus has more extremes in climate, especially in the winter. However, the critical difference between Eastern and Western Europe, and again I'll kind of draw a line right here showing the difference between Eastern and Western Europe, has to do with waterways. Western Europe has an abundance of navigable rivers, coastlines, and harbors along the Atlantic Ocean, on this side, along the Atlantic Ocean, as well as in the Mediterranean. So pretty much all, this is the Adriatic here, pretty much all the Mediterranean, lots of coastlines. Also in the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, and in the High Middle Ages, these fostered the revival of trade and the rise of towns, a money economy, and a middle class opposed to the feudal structure dominated by the nobles and church. Kings also opposed the nobles and the church, so the middle-class townsmen provided them with valuable allies and money. Now, with this money, kings could buy two things. So we have the rise of kings in Europe at this time, can buy two things. They can buy mercenaries, which allowed them to raise large armies armed with guns to limit the power of nobles, and they could form professional bureaucracies. And this is, of course, in Eastern Europe, what we're talking about here. These bureaucracies were staffed largely by their middle-class allies, who were both more efficient since they were literate, and more loyal since they were the king's natural allies, and depended on him for their positions. Now, as a result, kings in Western Europe were able to build strong, centralized nation-states by the 1600s. Now, Eastern Europe, in stark difference here, we're going to be talking about this part of Europe over here, Eastern Europe, in stark difference, in contrast to Western Europe, provided practically a mirror image of its historical development before 1600. Before being further inland compared to Western Europe hurt Eastern Europe's trade, since the sea and river waterways vital to trade did not exist there in such abundance as they did in Western Europe. Factors limiting trade also limited the growth of a strong middle class. So on this side we have limited trade, middle class, and we'll make this list here longer, trade and middle class in Eastern Europe. And this meant that kings had little in the way of money or allies to help them against the nobles. That in turn meant that peasants had few towns where they could escape the oppression of the nobles. Therefore, strong nobilities plus weak and oftentimes elective monarchies were the rule in Eastern Europe before 1600. At the same time, the nobles ruled over peasants whose status actually was sliding deeper into serfdom rather than emergence from it. So on this side of the line, we have serfdom as well. However, there were some geographical factors that favored Eastern Europe's rulers after 1600. That was the fact that Eastern Europe is next to Western Europe. And as a result, some influence from the West was able to filter to the East in particular, so some ideas were able to go this way. In particular, Eastern rulers would emulate Western counterparts by adopting firearms, mercenary armies, and professional bureaucracies. And as a result, they were able to build strongly centralized states in the 16 and 1700s. And this is especially true in the three states of Austria-Hungary, known as the Habsburg Empire, Brandenburg-Prussia in Germany, and Russia. However, the lower incidence of towns and strong middle class has continued to hamper the development of Eastern European states even in the modern era, since rulers there have had to build their states with less of a strong foundation of a money-based economy, basing their states on less developed agricultural economies instead. Now, while the strong middle class in Western Europe would provide the impetus for further developments in the West, notably the emergence of democracy and the Industrial Revolution, these two things have had a harder time taking root in Eastern Europe, making its overall political and economic development more difficult. All right, now we're going to take a look at one of these first groups that we've talked about, the Habsburg-Austria Empire. Now, when the 30 Years' War and Peace of Westphalia stifled Austrian ambitions in Germany, the Habsburgs, this group up here, the Habsburgs, expanded eastward against the Ottoman Empire. And ever since the death of Suleiman the Magnificent in 1565, the Ottoman Empire had been in serious decline with the corrupt government, rebellious army, obsolete military technology, and decaying economy. And this is the Ottoman Empire down here that I'm speaking of right now. However, the Habsburgs were never able to concentrate solely on the Turks. This was because France, under Louis, posed a constant threat of invasion to the various German states, which forced the Habsburg to divide their attention between the East and the West. So here's France with forcing invasion into the area as well. So they had to fight this war, this battle on two sides. Now, the Habsburg ruler at the time was a gentleman by the name of Leopold I, who reigned from 1657 to 1705. Very long reign. A mediocre ruler, but lucky enough to have capable generals to lead his armies. Now, Leopold's main goal was control of Hungary, which is this region right here, control of Hungary. This is what his primary goal was, which had been divided between Turkish and Australian rule for over a century. Now, when Leopold supported rebels in Transylvania against the Turks, war and an Ottoman invasion resulted. And at this time, the Turks were ruled by an able family of viziers, the Koprolus, who started reforming the state in order to make the Ottomans a power to contend with once again. Okay, so we're going to say Leopold versus let me spell this right, Koprolus. Okay, these were the Turks that we're talking about here, the viziers. And as a result, when the Turkish army started to advance westward, an alarm went up on all over Europe, with even Louis XIV sending 4,000 troops to send the Habsburgs. Now, in 1664, a much smaller and better equipped and trained Allied army caught and destroyed a Turkish army while it was crossing the Raba River, and this was the first major victory of a Christian army over the Ottomans. However, it encouraged Leopold's allies to feel secure enough to take their troops home, leaving him to face the Turks alone. And instead of continuing the fight, he signed a humiliating peace that damaged his reputation considerably. And as a result, the Hungarian nobles under his rule, rebelled and called in the Turks to help them. Now, this triggered the Turks' last major invasion of Europe, climaxing at the siege of Vienna, in 1683. A huge Turkish army, possibly 150,000 men, but with no large siege artillery, was faced by only the stout walls of Vienna and a garrison of 11,000 men. Now, the siege lasted 2 months, as the Turks gradually used the old medieval technique of undermining the walls. And just as the hour of the victory approached, a relief army from various European states arrived and crushed the Turkish army. And from 1683 to 1700, Habsburg forces and their allies advanced steadily against the Turks, only being interrupted by having to meet French aggression in the west. Now, in 1697, the Allied forces demolished another Turkish army at Zenta and watched as the once proud Janissaries murdered their own officers in the rout. Now, the resulting Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 gave Austria all of Hungary and Transylvania and Slovenia. Now, Karlowitz reestablished Austria, also known as Austria-Hungary, as a major European power from 1700 until the end of World War I in 1918. The Habsburg Empire would dominate southeastern Europe, while the Ottoman Empire staggered on as the sick man of Europe. Now, although the Habsburg Empire had regained its status as a military and diplomatic power, it still had serious internal problems. So let's talk a little bit about these internal problems. So internal problems. What were its internal problems? Namely, a powerful nobility ruling over enserfed peasants. So this is serfdom was an internal problem. A hodgepodge of peoples with nothing in common except that they all called Leopold their emperor. So ethnically diverse, we often call this an ethnically diverse population. And a variety of states. All these led to problems within Austria-Hungary. So how did this happen? So first of all, the Habsburgs dealt with these problems in three ways. So how do they deal with these problems? First of all, they neutralized the nobles politically. So neutralize nobles. They neutralized the nobles by making a deal that let them continue to oppress the peasants as long as they did not interfere in the government. This left the nobles fairly happy, while giving the Habsburg a free hand to run the state, largely with soldiers and bureaucrats recruited from all over parts of Europe. Unfortunately, this also left the empire socially and economically backward. Second, they tried to unite their empire religiously, so religion played in as well. They tried to unite their empire religiously and culturally by imposing the Catholic faith and promoting the German language. So religion, Catholic, and language, German. Okay, so these are two things that they tried to do here. The German language, this writing's not very good, I apologize. German language, Catholic faith. Now, trying to submerge native cultures, such as that of Bohemia, under Catholicism and German culture, mostly caused resentment against the Habsburgs' rule. And finally, they ruled each principality separately with its own customs and institutions. So separate principalities. Separate principalities. This kept nobles of different provinces from being able to combine in revolts against the Habsburgs, and it also left the empire fragmented into a number of separate provinces. A large standing army and bureaucracy also held the empire together. Now, for the next 2 centuries, the Habsburg Empire would be a major power in Europe. However, it had a number of serious problems that it never adequately solved, being socially and economically backward, and fragmented into a large number of provinces and increasingly restless ethnic groups. Now, together, these problems gradually ate away like a cancer at the Habsburg Empire, rotting it out from within until there was hardly anything left to hold it together by the 20th century. Now, as badly as the 30 Years' War had treated Habsburg Austria, it was much worse for the German states comprising the Holy Roman Empire. Now, some estimates of population loss in the war go as high as 35 to 40%, with material damage at an equally frightening level. However, human beings are a resilient species in the face of such adversity, and recovery was soon underway. Now, travelers in Germany a few years after the war noted a marked absence of men of military age, but an unusually high number of children, and by 1700s, Germany's population was back to its pre-war level of 20 million. Now, similar resilience was shown by the tiny state of Brandenburg-Prussia in northern Germany, and in 1648, no one looking at this poor little state devastated by war would have believed it was destined to one day unite all of Germany and become a major world power. Now, Brandenburg had lived under the rule of the write this crazy looking word out, Hohenzollern dynasty since 1411. When Frederick of Hohenzollern had purchased the territory and one of the 7 electoral votes of the empire along with it. In 1618, the Elector, as the ruler of Brandenburg was known, also got control of Prussia, some 100 miles to the east, holding it as a vassal of the King of Poland. Now, Brandenburg especially suffered during the 30 Years' War, since it was caught between the Catholic imperialists to the south and the Swedes to the north, not to mention its own rapacious mercenaries. Now, Frederick William is our next character here. Frederick William found an imposing array of problems that fell into 3 basic categories: geographic, military and diplomacy, or military and diplomatic problems, and finally, economic. So this is what Frederick William had to deal with: geographic, military, diplomatic, and economic. Frederick William's main geographic problem was that the territories of Brandenburg and Prussia were separated by 100 miles of Polish territory, making it very difficult to control and administer. Economically, Brandenburg was a poor country with few resources and a sandy soil that earned it the nickname the sandbox of Germany. And there were several factors aggravating the military and diplomatic situation. Now, worst of all was the devastation suffered at the hands of the imperialists, Swedes, and Brandenburg's own troops. An estimated 60% of the population was lost from the war, falling from 1.5 million to 0.6 million. Now, not only that, but Swedish troops were still on Brandenburg soil in 1640, with other powerful threatening neighbors such as Poland to the east and France to the west. Now, to meet these threats, Frederick William's army consisted mainly of unruly mercenaries, as likely to plunder his lands as defeat them. And he also faced a powerful class of nobles known as Junkers. Junkers. Oops. I spelled that wrong. Forgot a letter. Known as Junkers. There we go. Looks like the word Junkers. But a powerful noble class known as the Junkers. And he had to deal with these characters as well, who were a constant obstruction to the government. Now, Frederick William figured that, above all, he needed to tackle his military and diplomatic problems by building a good army to protect himself and his realm. The first step was to use what few reliable troops he had in order to destroy his old army of worthless mercenaries, and one by one he eliminated his old regiments until he had only an army of 2,500 men. But it was a loyal core upon which to build. Now, through diligence and hard work, Frederick William built an army, an excellent army, of some 8,000 men by 1648, and this was enough to give him a voice in the treaty talks at Westphalia. His main goal was to get Pomerania, which, although legally Brandenburg's, was occupied by Swedish troops. And he had to settle for half of Pomerania, but that was more than he could have expected 8 years earlier, and it did give him a coastline on the Baltic Sea. Now, inspired by his success, Frederick William kept building up his army and bureaucracy. For an officer corps and civil officials, he turned to the Junkers. Like his contemporary Leopold I of Austria, he let the nobles maintain their dominance over the serfs. But unlike Leopold, who did this to keep the nobles out of his government, Frederick William expected service to the state in return for those privileges. Now, the Junkers were expected to serve in the army as officers and as a highly efficient civil service that would provide better support for the army in the way of tax collection and supplies. And they received fancy uniforms and excellent training, and soon had developed a high morale and pride in themselves as the officer class of Brandenburg-Prussia. Now, that tradition of a proud Prussian officer class as the backbone of the state would continue all the way down to the 20th century, and as a result of his policy, Brandenburg-Prussia was the only state in Austria where the only state in Europe where the government successfully allied with the nobles and used them effectively in government service. Now, for recruits, Frederick William and his successors started to rely increasingly on peasant draftees rather than the unpredictable and expensive foreign mercenaries. So, peasant draftees. Such soldiers were much cheaper than mercenaries and much less prone to looting, although not as efficient. Now, during peacetime, they could be kept in training for a few months each year, while letting them farm and be productive the rest of the time. And by the end of his reign, Frederick William was able to field an army of 45,000 men, with a smaller but still sizable standing peacetime army. Now, in addition to defense, the army also helped Frederick increase his power internally, since he could use it to demand taxes and enforce his policies. With those taxes, he could increase his army, which further increased his authority, and so on. And as a result, Frederick William laid the firm foundations for absolutism in Brandenburg-Prussia. Now, as far as Brandenburg-Prussia's divided geography was concerned, Frederick William developed a postal system, which better tied together his scattered postal system, which better put together his scattered empire. Now, even so, Brandenburg-Prussia was still a small fish in a big pond, and a turbulent pond at that. The later 1600s were hardly more peaceful than the early 1600s, with an aggressive Sweden to the north and Louis XIV France to the west, keeping Europe's armies constantly on the march. Now, throughout his reign, he skillfully switched sides whenever convenient and sold his army's services to the highest bidder or most useful allies. For example, in the fighting between Louis XIV and the Dutch Republic, he switched sides 3 times in the Northern War between Poland and Sweden. Frederick William at first was neutral, then on Sweden's side, and finally on Poland's side, in return for recognition of his title to Prussia being totally independent of his overlord, Poland. Now, Frederick William was also every bit as talented a ruler in building his realm economically as he was in military and diplomatic affairs. There were several things he did to restore Brandenburg-Prussia's prosperity. For one thing, he took an active interest in development and use of new agriculture. So let me write on the map here. So he used agriculture and developing new techniques in order to farm. So agriculture became very important to him. Also, Frederick William encouraged immigration. While other states in Europe were moving people around and removing people, he was actually allowing people to come in. Thus, and finally, the government controlled monopolies. Government controlled monopolies on the production and sale of such commodities as salt and silk, and the efficient management of these monopolies raised important funds for the government. So agriculture, immigration, and monopolies. Now, Frederick William's military reforms and concerns for the economy caused him to use the army during peacetime to develop public works projects. For example, the army built a canal connecting Berlin, the capital, to the Oder River, thus increasing trade and tax revenues. And much of that extra revenue surely went back into the army. But at least it was partially able to pay for itself in peacetime, and has also kept the army from causing trouble during times of peace and idleness. Now, by Frederick William's death in 1688, Brandenburg-Prussia was in better shape than before the 30 Years' War. Its population was back up to pre-war levels, while its tax revenues had increased from $59,000 in the 1640 to $1.5 million in 1689, over 25 times its original revenue. Its army provided more security than ever before, while also giving Brandenburg-Prussia an unprecedented amount of international prestige and respect. However, this was only the beginning. Frederick William's reforms set the stage for 2 centuries of steady growth and expansion that would culminate in the unification of Germany and its rise to the status of a world power in the 19th and 20th centuries.